budget model named the A300. But this never happened. Germany were pressing for an IDE based Amiga, so it was quickly changed from a budget A300 to include PCMCIA and an IDE controller to allow 2.5-inch laptop sized hard drives. The upshot of all this was that the machine itself cost about $60 more to produce than the Amiga 500 Plus that they were phasing out. So the A300s were quickly changed to A600s and sold as an upgraded A500. In fact, the Amiga 600 early revisions have A300 printed on the motherboards, showing that they were still trying to produce it cheaper than an A500, but clearly they failed. The early Amiga 600s have a slightly different version of Amiga OS, although it still is 2.05. It has the version number 37.299. This does not support the built-in IDE, nor does it support the PCMCIA. So you will have to change the Kickstart ROM if you have one of these machines. The drivers themselves for the IDE and the PCMCIA were loaded from a floppy disk drive. So the IDE will not auto boot. Later versions 37.300 and 37.350 address this problem, and the drivers were built into ROM. The small size of the A600 also added to its problems. Some software of the day required keys that were no longer available, i.e. the keypad. Now these were few and far between and were slightly exaggerated by the press of the day, but nonetheless, if you had a flight simulator or some of the whatever game it was, if you had one that required the keypad and you didn't have a keypad, well, you were buggered. Even now it's a problem. If you run WHD load, quite often it will say press page up or print screen or whatever it is to quit. You can't do that on a 600 because they don't actually have those keys on the keyboard, so you will have to change the addressing of the key. Anyway, as usual with the Amiga, there were various bundles and Christmas bundles and all the rest of it. Prices started at $399. There was a later version, the Amiga hard drive. I think it said A600 HD along the top on a silver badge. My friend got one of these from Dixon's, I think it was, back in the day. I think it was faulty actually. I think he got it cheap because it was faulty. They were going to send it back to Commodore, but for whatever reason it never went. It was sat in Dixon's back office. They had one. Can you believe it? One of these. They had the other ones, the normal 600s, but they only had one HD. Not that it made much difference, it just came with a 30 megabyte RDA hard drive. But anyway. Yeah, hard drives. The 600 as a 2.5-inch IDE header soldered to the motherboard, which means you can fit a laptop hard drive, which is fine and dandy these days. But back in the early 90s, the 2.5-inch hard drives were phenomenally expensive, much more expensive than 3.5-inch hard drives. And this was seen as a very silly decision by many people, including me. I just, I was starting to look at PCs to move from the Amiga to a PC at this time, and the news of the A600 coming sort of held me off a little bit. I thought, oh, a new Amiga, faster, better, but it wasn't to be. It was a 600. Incredibly disappointed with it. It looked naff, I always thought. Excuse me. Anyway, so the A600 never really sold very well. It was a machine that nobody wanted, nobody asked for, but Commodore produced anyway. So the only way they could shift them was basically to kill the A500 production, and ended up reducing the cost of the A600 to sell it. People were still going into Dixon's and Curry's and Boots and things, and still asking for Amiga 500s, and to be told we can't get them, but we've got a new 600 that nobody wanted. Anyway, to further rub salt into the wound, Commodore then released the Amiga 1200 just a few months after the 600, which effectively killed most of the sales of the A600 anyway. The 1200 was what people actually wanted. They didn't want the 600. So the 600 was a very short-lived machine. It is generally the most disliked of all the Amiga range. It looks cheap, it was made cheaply, and it suffers from quite a few little problems. Like the 500, the A600 was aimed at the Commodore 64 market, i.e. the cheaper end. By this time the Amiga 3000 was out, and this was the high-end machine, which was an upgrade from the A2000. It was a full 32-bit machine. So the 600 was supposedly a Commodore 64 type cheap machine to sell, I suppose. But it cost $50 or $60 more to make than a 500, so it was a complete waste of time. David Pleasance at the time famously said that the A600 was a complete and utter screw-up. In comparison to the Pop with 500, it was unexpandable, you could not improve on the CPU performance, it was more expensive, lacked in the numerical keyboard, meaning that some software doesn't work. What else can I say about it? I had the Wild, Weird and Wicked bundle of the A600, which was an A600 bundled with a few games. I think it came with D-Paint as well. The idea being to try and revitalise the flagging sales of the 600. I don't know whether it worked very well or not. But my ROM version was 37.350. The Amiga 600 was also made in the UK. It was made in Irvine in Scotland, although I think mine was actually made in Hong Kong. I seem to remember having a Hong Kong sticker on it. The 600 was another standard 6800 base CPU running at 7 MHz, but this time it was a surface mount CPU, not a DIP package, so you could not pop the CPU out and put a 6810 in it. You couldn't plug in an accelerator from a 500 because they didn't fit anymore. It was a compact, quite small, neat motherboard, but it was all surface mount for the first time. Commodore had spent a lot of money changing everything to surface mount to make things more reliable, they say. The RAM itself shipped with 1 MB of chip RAM, no fast RAM. If you plugged a expansion into the trapdoor, it gave it 2 MB chip RAM, which was quite good. You could also plug in up to 4 MB fast RAM into the PCMCIA socket on the side, which cost a fortune and you couldn't find them anywhere. There were very few PCMCIA accessories at this time when the Amiga was launched. In fact, the PCMCIA standard wasn't finalised until after the 600 was launched. You could say forward thinking. I'm not so sure. The graphics, it was a standard Amiga. It was the ECS chipset as per the 500 Plus. Came with Workbench 2, Kickstart 2. They could be various revisions, 37.229, 37.30 or 37.35. Although all the ROMs were officially marked 2.05, just to make things even more confusing. Like I say, the original ROM wouldn't boot from IDE, so if you've got one of those you'll have problems. And I think the next ROM upgrade had a limitation on the size of the hard drive. I think it was capped at 40 MB. I have had one of these. In fact, I have one kicking about somewhere. And I forgot about this, and I spent hours trying to get a CF working on it before it eventually dawned on me that I needed to change the ROM. As soon as I put a 3.1 ROM in, it found the hard drive and away it went. It was fine. You can upgrade the ROMs. That is still a DIP package, so you can pop it out and put in there a later Workbench Kickstart 2 or a later Kickstart ROM 3, 3.1, whatever you like. What else can I say about it? The biggest benefit of an Amiga 600 is the ability to run a Vampire 1 or Vampire 2 accelerator card. Ideally a Vampire 2, as this will give you RTG 128 megabyte and well above 100 megahertz. These cards are pretty impressive. I will do a video on the Vampire later, but that's another video. Problems. The Amiga 600. The Amiga 600 is beset by problems. The keyboard membranes fracture and the keys don't work anymore, so the keyboards are usually faulty on old 600s. Well, they're all old. The cases are particularly brittle and they have clips on the rear edge of them, like a C64. So when people pop them open, the clips break. I think there's only 3 or 4 screws on the case and the rest of it's clips, and they all snap off. The floppy drives are notoriously poor for breaking and failing, and the buttons fall off. The LED wires on the 3 LED lights for floppy access, hard drive and power, the wires break off because they get brittle now, they're quite old, and the capacitors leak on the motherboards. So it's not unknown to have real basket case Amiga 600s, even though they're a newer machine compared to the A500, where a 500 will survive, a 600 won't. Upgrades. The 600 is extremely limited in what you can do with it. The CPU is a surface mount package, so you can't unplug it, which means that any accelerator has to be pushed on top and is reasonably awkward to fit securely. Having said that, Jens manufactures some ACA cards that fit on there, the ACA 630 I think it is, that plugs on one. I haven't used one, so I don't know. There's the Furia 68030 I think it is, and of course the Vampire cards, which I'll pop on there. There were a couple of cards back in the day that did appear, but they were incredibly expensive and didn't sell very well, obviously. The biggest asset to the 600 is the IDE and the PCMCIA, because the IDE, obviously you can pop a CF compact flash in there and run Classic Workbench or 3.9 or whatever tickles your particular fancy. The PCMCIA is a slot 1 or type 1, so it's the early adapter. So you can have a FAT32 compact flash card adapter plugged in there, but it will have to be a type 1, not a type 2. They have a slightly different configuration. There was also CD-ROMs, SCSI drive adapters, network cards, and obviously FAT32 CFs that plug in there. That's about it for the Amiga 600. It's not my favourite machine. I was incredibly disappointed when I saw it initially in 1991. I expected something big from Commodore, because they were losing ground massively to the consoles and the PC. So I thought Commodore, they'll come out the bag with something impressive now, just to get the Amiga back in the limelight, because Commodore was a big presence in the UK. They were constantly advertising, the magazines were full of adverts, there were magazines on the shelf, there was at least 4, 5, 6 magazines each month for the Amiga, or had Amiga content anyway. They were in the press all the time, there was news stories. They were always in the press from games like Cannon Fodder, the scandal, imaginary scandal that caused. Violence in games will corrupt children, and all that sort of nonsense. So when the 600 came along, that was the final nail in the coffin to me. I'd lost interest in Commodore. I thought they were a lost cause by this time. Completely ridiculous. The 1200 changed that a little bit, but that's another video. So that'll do from me. Thank you very much, and have a good bank holiday weekend.